Welcome back to Connect for Health, the monthly webinar and podcast series dedicated to helping you live a healthier life, brought to you by Cigna Healthcare, Middle East and Africa, with a little bit of support from Mental. I'm Scott Armstrong, your host. I'm the founder of Mental, a platform dedicated to tackling the stigma of mental health. And my co-host today is Alison Sharp, Director of Client Management, Cigna Healthcare. Welcome back. This is your first live Connect for Health. We've been on the webinar many times before.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. Happy to be here.
Great to have you, Alison. And today's topic is around understanding autism, support at work, school and home. Now, this is a dedicated follow-on session to our last episode on ADHD, neurodiversity and autism. We had a great conversation, lots of engagement from you, the viewers, with lots of questions, almost more than we could handle. And we were aware when we came off that podcast that we probably leaned too much into not too much into ADHD, but autism didn't get as much of the share of the conversation that perhaps it deserved. So this is a dedicated episode just for you. We've tried to weave some of the questions that audience members asked. So also remember that if you are joining us live, you can ask our guests your questions. This podcast is for you, so please ask your questions, and we will be asking you polls to get involved in those later on. If you are watching us on the YouTube channel, on the catch-up, or on the podcast, please remember you can't get involved in the live interactivity. I don't know what's going on with my words today. Probably too much coffee. But please reach out to Cigna Healthcare for details of membership and join us live next time. Okay, so to get into it, we have got two amazing guests to join us in this topic today. Our first is Dr. Shereen Sharaan, who is research lead for psychology at the University of Birmingham Dubai. She's also principal investigator of all autism research within the Department of Psychology. Now, before entering academia, Shereen spent more than a decade working as an autism support worker here in the UAE, where she was born and raised. Her journey is deeply personal. It began with her younger brother, Amro, who in 2001 became the first autistic child in the UAE to receive official mainstream inclusion and also graduate years later from high school. Shereen's mother also founded the Emirates Autism Centre in Abu Dhabi, making autism advocacy and inclusion a lasting family legacy. And it's also worth saying that Shereen's previous autism work on language and digital inclusion has been recognised internationally with the 2021 Autistica Real World Impact Award, nationally within the 2025 Mental Award for Outstanding Diversity, Equity, Inclusion and Initiative. And remember, entries are open for that now. Quick sales pitch there. So Shereen, great to have you on Connect for Health today. Our second guest is also an inspiring individual, Sophie Smith, the CEO and founder of Nabta Health, which is the Middle East's leading women's health technology company. Inspired by the early loss of her grandmother, Rixa, and by her own experience moving to the region while pregnant, Sophie founded Nabta in 2017 with the belief that women everywhere deserve timely, dignified care. Under her leadership, Nabta has grown into an AI-powered, vertically integrated ecosystem for women's health in the Middle East and Africa. In 2025, Nabta was recognized by Time magazine, none less, as one of the world's top health tech companies. Sophie's also the founder of the hashtag 2022 Female Angels. Go search for that. Advocating for gender parity in startup funding, and is recognized globally as a voice for women's health innovation, equity and sovereignty. And also importantly for today's conversation, Sophie also brings the lived experience as someone with ADHD, which is meaning both autism and ADHD. Shereen and Sophie, welcome to Connect for Health. This is going to be an amazing conversation. I know this already. Shereen, let's start with you. Obviously, your connection to autism is sort of both personal, professional, academical and practical. And we were talking off camera before about misconceptions. When we say autism, what are we really talking about? And what do you find most people get wrong? What are the common stereotypes out there that you would like to challenge straight off the bat?
That could be a podcast on its own.
I believe so.
But I'll start by saying that it's not that easy to define autism just because it's a way of being in the world. But I'll start by saying it is lifelong, number one. The second thing I would say, it is what we call a neurodevelopmental condition. And so it sounds really complicated, but basically it's the idea that brain differences took place really early on in life. And that's typically even before you are born. So it's not just something that shows up in adulthood, it's developmental. And it is a different way of being in the world. So an autistic brain will basically receive information from the world, perceive it in a different way, process it in a different way, organize it in a different way, and then translate it into behavior in a different way. And we could take like just a cafe as an example. We all walk into a cafe right now. We're a mix of neurotypical and neurodivergent people. We're in the same place, but we're having very, very different experiences. So for most people, you can just go in and tune out the sound of like dishes cluttering in the background, people chattering, the music in the cafe, and you can just focus on a conversation with the person that you're with. For some autistic people, all those things may be competing for attention at the same time. And again, so they're instantly experiencing it very differently, but then they're going to translate that into a very different behavior than yours. They could close off their ears, they could walk up and leave. So right there, we see a different translation of those sensory experiences really early on. As far as misconceptions, there are so many. I think one of the ones I'd like to begin with, just because I see this a lot, particularly in our region, is that the dominant view of an autistic person in the UAE, and maybe even more broadly in the Arab world or even in the Eastern world, is that of a high support needs person who's less cognitively abled, who's not independent, who has an intellectual disability. And I just want to clarify that that's 30 to 40% of autistic people, which means the majority of autistic people do not have an intellectual disability, and they do communicate, or they can, with spoken language. So that's something to sort of keep in mind. Now, this, say 20 to 40% is actually where my younger brother falls. He has profound autism. He does have an intellectual disability. And this takes us to another really big misconception. So he experienced what we call autistic regression. So basically he seemed very typically developing from birth. And so there's this idea that my child was typically developing and then became autistic. The child was not typically developing and then became autistic. There were always these early biological differences, but their expression is what becomes visible or noticeable at a certain age. So you can think of like a young child's brain like a fast-growing garden with plants, and each plant like has all these like new branches that are growing, and you can think of those branches as like brain connections that are forming. And we need those brain connections because that's how brain cells basically pass information to one another. So you have a new brain connection, great, new messages, and so on. And what happens is that our brains automatically do this process of trimming, just like a gardener trims plants and these branches to strengthen those new branches, but maybe take down the ones that are not going to be so strong or maybe not so needed. And so the brain does a very similar process where it basically does a process of trimming. It strengthens certain connections and then takes down or prunes other connections. And between ages 12 to 30 months, the brain goes through a very rapid period of development, and that's when language skills take off, social communication becomes very complicated, and there are brain pathways for that or connections for that. And in some autistic people, basically those processes or connections may not strengthen at the usual level. So during this rapid period of brain development, before that, they were speaking, they were socializing, they had eye contact, because, again, we haven't come to that rapid development stage yet where that really massive trimming and strengthening of connections is taking place. And so what happens is that some of those connections don't form at the usual level, and the child suddenly loses skills that they had once acquired. And so my younger brother's an example of that. He had about 400 plus words at age 2, lost all of them in 12 days. It became one word. Water, 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 you're water, I'm water. Socially became quite withdrawn. He used to be just the first person to run straight to you, give you a hug, whoever you were. So socially became quite withdrawn. And so that is the regression. This is when parents start to notice just a loss of skill in some skills, could be in all skills. And that is exactly what is happening. But it's not that the child became autistic. It's just that biological sort of process, that fine-tuning that happened at a certain point impacted the connections that are needed for language, for social development, and that's when we start to see things. So those are a couple of misconceptions that I would begin with.
I have to bring you in here, Sophie, because you were nodding as well as Shereen was saying. And obviously, you've grown up all your life and lived with both autism and ADHD. So what gelled with there? What are the sort of the misconceptions people have perhaps had of you when you've introduced yourself and gone, because you are very open about your lived experience, but what are those things that you feel that need to be challenged?
So I only got my diagnosis now about 2 years ago, when I went in pursuit of more mindful parenting techniques for my daughter, my second child, who I would say was noticeably further along the autism spectrum. And I was speaking to the psychiatrist about her. And I was stood up, and it was the end of a very long and stressful day, and I wasn't making eye contact with her, and I was rocking, slowly from foot to foot. She was giving me this long, hard stare, and I was like, I have autism spectrum disorder and ADHD as well, don't I? Because I had presented her with my hypothesis around my daughter. She was like, yes, Sophie, I think you do. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the immediate feeling after I was diagnosed was one of intense grief for maybe 2 to 3 months, not because of the diagnosis, but because I had always felt unfairly misclassified my entire life. She's crazy, she's stubborn, she's abrupt, all of these things, because as you said, you process things differently. If you're on the autism spectrum, I think a lot of people have naturally systematizing minds. There are things that neurotypical people care about that neurodivergent people just do not. And again, certain social experiences are received and processed very differently. So the reason I was nodding when you were talking about the cafe is because that was universally my experience of going out at university and then at some networking events when I was working. So I get overstimulated very easily. By particularly in these networking environments where, you have low light, you have loud music, and you're expected to make conversation. And I mean, in environments where you go out clubbing are very similar to this. And so I would often, go out with my friends, be desperate to go out and actually have a good night out. Within, 10 to 15 minutes, I'd be right on the periphery of the room, just kind of immediately going into observation mode, and often would leave quite quickly. And I remember, it was such an effort for me. I used to have to try really hard to do it. I really wanted to be included, and then was like, why can't you just enjoy a night out like everybody else? And then when I realized that my brain worked differently, and my goodness, it happened so late. I think as women, we're very effective at masking. I saw it in my own daughter from an incredibly young age, 2 or 3. That we don't give ourselves a chance to really understand, and we're not told that our brains are maybe wired a little differently. But now, the peace that I have in not pushing myself to be comfortable in environments where I am fundamentally not wired to be comfortable is immense. So occasionally I'll go to events like this, but I will understand that I will go and I will stand in the corner, that I will observe that if I'm going to have a conversation, it's going to be in that quiet corner with anybody who comes over to me. I won't try to do things that I'm incompatible with in the same way anymore.
Can I ask, Sophie, you say overstimulated, so you said that you stay on the periphery and you prefer to observe. When you say overstimulated, what does that feel like for you?
It just feels like there are too many inputs, you're getting a lot of different types of light, a lot of different types of noise. I mean, it's something that a lot of people experience as they age. as people start to go deaf, my great uncle used to talk about it. He finds it more difficult to land on a particular frequency. So if he's having a conversation with somebody, but there are 3 or 4 other people having conversations around him, he'll hear 2 words here and he'll hear 2 words here and he'll 2 words here. And eventually he can't stay in the conversation. So that's what it feels like. It just feels very, very effortful. And for me, I get tired very quickly.
If I can add, I've had an autistic person in my research describe this as being tuned into 40 channels at once.
Yeah.
You just turned on the TV 40 times, 40 different channels at the same time, which I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, it just, at some point you're like, no, and then you get, you start to get stressed. Like you can feel your heart rate increases, all the signs of like a stress response coming to you. And that, and this experience that you can see other people enjoying, that you're meant to be enjoying, you're like, why am I not enjoying this? Why is it making me so stressed? But it's just overstimulated. And I found it with my children as well. So when my daughter was 2, she used to have these intense meltdowns where basically the combination of different stimuli, the light, the sounds, even the touch, the interaction with the person in front of her, and she totally melt down, like couldn't snap herself out of it. The only way that I could get her to calm down was to put her in the cupboard under the stairs, which sounds horrendous. It wasn't a punishment, but it was the complete removal of external stimuli. And in this environment, in this darkness, in this quiet, where nobody was trying to touch or interact with her, within 30 seconds she'd calm down. It was the only thing at that age that would like regulate her nervous system again.
I've literally got a million questions, and anybody that knows me knows I'm trying really hard not to jump in and just sit back and listen, because it's so powerful what you've both said there in the opening. I actually wanted to come back to you though, Alison, because obviously, I think one of the observations from our last conversation around ADHD is we kind of all had ADHD, so we had some affinity with it. But hearing Shereen and Sophie's stories and experiences, how does that, as someone you openly said before, and I'm actually coming to this almost with a blank sheet, I'm here to learn. What really sort of lands with you? What, that's powerful?
Absolutely. I am coming from probably a naive perspective with very limited interactions of autism. So the analogies that you're given are fascinating, the tree and the trimming, the 40 channels. Again, that makes sense to me. That would be uncomfortable and overwhelming. So thank you for giving those analogies that are easy to understand. You have both mentioned spectrum. Is it right that previously the spectrum was kind of thought as a straight line, like more or less, and traditionally it was thought of as a straight line, but that perception is changing, and yes, they're saying that it's more complex than that? Is that correct understanding?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, they might imagine spectrum as this straight line from mild to severe autism. And I would encourage people to think of it more as a slider for different things. So there's a slider for communication, a slider for sensory experiences, there's a slider for everything else. And within one single person, those sliders could vary. So my slider for, let's say, my sensory overload or sensory experiences is just about here right now. So I'm good. I don't really have these sensitivities on a noticeable level. They don't really bother me. But then come talk to me here, for example, with my social communication, and I will have difficulties in 1, 2, 3, 4. So, and I always give an example. For example, in class 2, my students, I say something like, if I'm autistic, I'm this world-renowned author, for example. I publish books, I do this, I do that, but I can't tie my shoelaces. Or something like the sound or flicker of light will just give me a meltdown. Am I, what people would use high functioning or low functioning, which are very, very poor terms. They don't tell us anything about your level of functioning, because you could be functioning really high in this domain at this time of day. Check with me at the end of the day. I could be very different on that slider. So, yeah, I think I've actually heard fellow researchers refer to it more as a constellation rather than this spectrum, this straight line from mild to severe. So not only are autistic people different to one another in terms of their needs and abilities, but also within the individual themselves, they have different support needs in different domains of life. And finally, I just wanted to say I was recently at this event at my university, University of Birmingham in the UK campus. And I walked into the event and they had these interaction badges, which I've seen before. So something like a green badge means you can approach me, you can come say hi, you can talk to me, I'm open. Then they have this orange colored badge, which was like, approach me with caution, like check with me if I'm okay to talk or to ask me questions. And then they had this red badge, do not approach me, do not initiate any conversation with me. I've seen that before. I've done that before at my own events and research. What I have not seen before is that instead of having it as like this badge in a plastic sort of format, is that they were like stickers so that people could change them at different parts of the day. So I might start out the day as a green, come talk to me, autistic person at the start of the day where things are nice and quiet and structured. But at the end of the day, I'm going to switch that to a red tag because I don't want you to approach me. My support needs have literally changed just because of the time of day and the context.
Yeah, the way I find it really helpful to envisage it is, again, when do we say that somebody has spectrum differences? So if you imagine in mathematics, you have these standard normal distribution curves that look like this, and you have a statistically significant difference if you are 1 or 2 deviations from the normal curve. And if you then imagine that, for all of these things that Dr. Shereen mentioned, you have curves that kind of sit on top of one another like this until you create something that looks a little bit like a hill. Most of your neurotypical folk will live exclusively with all different, metrics in the center at the top of the hill or somewhere on it. Whereas for a neurodivergent individual, they're somewhere like at the bottom in the valley, maybe with everything kind of out here. And it's, again, in terms of that feeling of, we design our world for people who are on the hill. You're in the valley with 1, 2, 4, every different thing. You can end up feeling a little bit excluded, and like this world that we occupy is not built for you. But it's a multi-dimensional thing. It's not linear at all. And this was also, again, helpful for me in terms of my own understanding about autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, because they are 2 quite different conditions, and they often compete with one another in your brain, which is also an interesting reality to live with. Thinking of everything in multiple dimensions, I think always is helpful.
I found that really, really fascinating. And even as someone who is neurodivergent, and Sophie knows I only found out about that last year, which was quite powerful. But even that kind of revelation, or you explaining that actually even in a given day or even within a 4 or 5 hour period, you might start at the bottom of the hill, but you might move up the hill, or you might start in the middle of the hill and move down the hill. And even within the space of a few hours, there's that range. What are the kind of things that affect that positioning on the hill that help you either move up or move down? What are there tactics, or how does it express itself?
So I would say from personal experience, it's everything that you are told to do on a daily basis in terms of movement, diet, and sleep. But 2x. So how does a lack of sleep, for example, manifest from an autism spectrum and an ADHD perspective? So I'm somebody who really likes routine. Needs it, in fact. I need structure. I like to understand the rules. I have a very systematizing mind. If I encounter a new person, I want to understand how they became that person, the systems that support them, the experiences that got them there. It means that, again, you end up asking a lot of very direct questions, and in the first conversation or 2, actually understanding a person perhaps much better than you should, given the amount of time you've spent with them. The need for structure becomes much greater when I am tired. And if I deviate from my routine, it becomes much harder. I feel much more emotionally fraught. I have to, I can feel myself getting much more stressed. So that intense need for routine, the intensity just amps up if I'm tired. From an ADHD perspective, again, you have this hyper-focus, hyper-inattentiveness thing where the things that you really like, you focus on with in neurotypical terms, perhaps unhealthy degree of obsession. And then sometimes to counterbalance that, you need to move, or, if you encounter something that you're not interested in, you're really not interested in it. If I am tired, my need to move in order to focus again increases. So I can find that even if I don't have meetings that I need to get to, I will drive 200 kilometers around the city from place to place to place, in every place sitting 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 1 hour for a meeting or to get some, task where I need to focus done. So my need to move in order to focus amps up. So as soon as I start to become more, I guess, kind of intense around my routine, and the amount I'm spending on petrol increases, I'm like, Sophie, you're tired. You need to focus on sleep and hydration and like the basic things more for the next few days. So I think it's all the essentials, but the need for them is increased.
And your tactics that you've learned, the driving from place to place that you've found to help you, has that been trial and error? If you've not been diagnosed till later in life and you've had to cope with this without the diagnosis, has it been trial and error to figure out ways that can help you day to day?
Well, so I'd say that driving from place to place is a symptom of a depleted mind. So as soon as I notice myself starting to do that, like the way that I address it is by going to bed earlier, trying to remove stimulation from my evenings and my mornings. Driving 200 kilometers because you're struggling to focus when you're sitting still is not a solution. But now I've managed to identify it as a symptom, I am able to address it in healthy ways.
I just want to come back to you as well, Shereen, on and react and reflect on what Sophie's been saying there, because as a sibling, it seems like there are some powerful lessons there because there are those who are living with neurodivergence, and then there are Sophie's a mother as well, or a sibling, a sister, a brother, a parent, a colleague. What does that teach us about how we can support when even within a given day that individual might need different things throughout the day? What are the things that you notice that, and you will obviously lived that, how do you process that as someone supporting? Because, it must have been absolutely heartbreaking as Amaro's sister to see bright young Amaro and then go to one word. I mean, what is the emotions connected to that?
Yeah.
How you move through that, but also then how you support.
I mean, I think I'll start by saying, let's say within the workplace first, because there's an example that comes to mind because my line manager is autistic, and he has masked all his life. And one of the things that he constantly does is force eye contact. So when we first crossed paths, like 4 years ago, I joined the department and I figured he was autistic. So you don't have to do that with me, right? You don't need to do that. And he's like, no, I have to do that now because I've been doing it for so long that there is just as uncomfortable and as incredibly painful. I still need to keep doing it. So I said, okay, keep doing it. But then I would avoid his gaze while he's speaking. And he's like, don't do that. Look at me, because now I'm thinking that you're not listening to me. I'm thinking certain things. So look back at me. I'm like, there is no, this is just the cost of masking for so long. And when you consider like someone day in, day out of their lives, thinking questions like, am I being normal enough here? Am I looking at you long enough? Am I interrupting you? Smile. And then all these different things, just day after day after day, year after year, at some point you really can't, establish when did masking begin, when does it end. And that was one of the, actually a participant quote from my research, is that a participant was saying, some people could tell you exactly when they mask and how they mask. And some people were like, I have no idea what I do when I mask. I don't know when it begins. I don't know when it ends. So in terms of supports, I think definitely asking colleagues in general. So let's say if you're working with the colleagues who have additional support needs, just asking like what would help you work best without them necessarily disclosing anything. There are ways to be inclusive without necessarily you having to come to share your diagnosis. But, how do you work best? What can I do? Some people, for example, may prefer to contribute to this meeting using a chat function. rather than speaking, great. Some people might benefit more from a hybrid working arrangement. Some people may benefit from like a temporary use of quiet spaces. And those are all really low budget things. Like they do not require extra resources or anything like that. You could just be sensitive to that and sort of make inclusion the default rather than people coming up to you and having to ask those kind of things. So that's what I would do to support in, let's say, a workplace setting. Within the home setting, this is really, really tricky because Amr did go to school and was the first autistic child at the time to receive that formal process of mainstream inclusion. He graduated. That's an amazing milestone. But at what cost? He can't tell us. He has profound autism. He has high support needs. He has an intellectual disability. I don't know. So he definitely opened doors for a lot of people at the time because that journey just did not exist before that. But we will never know at what cost. And so support for me becomes like just trying to pick up on certain cues, nonverbal cues that would tell me his behavior, that would tell me like how is this day, is this week, is this stretch of school looking like for you so far when things are too much? Because that's how he would basically express that. Looking for ways to make him more comfortable, and just trying to this is something that, for example, I have not done, but you need to keep in mind that when you are caregiving, let's say for someone with high support needs, which would be my parents so far, they're his primary caregivers, is that you need to get them support as well because they are the ones who are basically in the face of that full-time support and care for siblings as well. I mean, I'm in my mid to late 30s now, and I've only just met other siblings of autistic people through my research, which is asking them about their research priorities as siblings. What do you want me to research? So yeah, those are the kinds of things that I would do to support someone who is, really who has high support needs. Now, for most autistic people, like I said, they do not have an intellectual disability, and I think we should be really mindful of the language that we use because the way adults talk about children really shapes their inner world, and research has consistently shown us this. So I think a really good way to support would be avoid secrecy or talking about a diagnosis. Sophie's a mom as well. I'm sure she has a lot to weigh in here, but research tells us that actually you do need to take a very hands-on approach here, age-appropriate, honest communication. Children know when something's being discussed about them. They know when you think there's a problem. And also having them like co-lead with those decisions, like what would help you? What do people not understand about you? What do you want us as parents to know about you? What should we do? I think that's quite key and really screams out from us, from the data itself, telling us that this is probably the most appropriate thing to do for a child.
Just to say to you audience, I can see that the questions are coming in and I am desperate to get you involved. I want to ask Alison one question and then we'll do our first poll and then we'll roll into some of your questions as well. I just felt it might be good because to ask you almost what your understanding of the term is, because I never knew about masking until a year ago not even a year ago, 6 months ago when I was diagnosed with ADHD. And I'm still in that question, like I'm not quite sure who is Scott and who is the mask. That is a process that I'm going through. But I think there may be people on the call as well, or people on, tuning in that might not quite understand what masking is and what it looks like. What is, from that perspective, what's your understanding, or how do you feel about that?
I'll be completely honest and be my understanding is probably very limited. Yeah. So my understanding of autism is going to be very basic. My understanding is that it's a difference in how you think, feel and communicate. And masking is your coping mechanisms to try and not show your neurodivergence. Is that fair?
Of course, yeah.
And is it right that it can be very different, the masking can be very different to spot between a boy, girl, adult, male, female? Is that correct?
Brilliant
that it can
question. Brilliant question, yeah. Please. Sophie, go for it. Particularly, you were saying like your daughter.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah, so I think, most of the statistics we have for neurodivergent individuals are male-leaning because our diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder and ADHD for a very long time and still were male factor. And they like ADHD looks like totally different things in boys versus girls. a boy who has ADHD in an inattentive moment might stand up and run out of the room, whereas a girl will often sit and stare off into the distance because she's running in her head. So it's typical for boys to be diagnosed with some form of neurodivergence in childhood, in their early teens. Most women don't get diagnosed until their 30s and 40s. And a lot of that is to do with the fact that they start to mask very early. When they hit normal adulthood, the sex hormones come into play and are significant regulators of dopamine and GABA. So estrogen is our kind of primary regulator of other hormones. And when you are in your kind of normal adulthood period before you hit perimenopause, unless you have other hormonal imbalances, this is fairly stable. But it's why, for example, in estrogen deplete moments, so in the second half of your menstrual cycle, particularly in the week before your period, or if you've just given birth and you're breastfeeding, so your prolactin is elevated and estrogen is low, neurodivergent women often struggle a lot more. So, for example, women with ADHD are 3 to 4 times more likely than neurotypical women to suffer with PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is like the extreme version of PMS, because the helping hand that estrogen gives them during the first half of their menstrual cycle disappears in the immediate run up to their period. And then obviously during perimenopause, you have wild fluctuations in your estrogen levels, declining also over a period, and this helping hand that estrogen has given you kind of disappears. And it's why, again, a lot of undiagnosed neurodivergent women, as they're going through perimenopause, will present suddenly at a doctor with not only a host of physical symptoms, but often the statement, I feel like I'm going crazy. I'm not myself anymore. I have this incredible rage, presenting with emotional and mental symptoms of extreme hormonal imbalance. That is much more common in neurodivergent women.
And can hormone replacement help with that?
It absolutely can, yes. So, there's a lot that you can do to regulate your hormones, sex hormones or otherwise, through lifestyle. So when you're going through perimenopause, estrogen regulates your entire chemical messaging system. But one of the other hormones that it helps to regulate is cortisol, your stress hormone. So there's a lot that you can do proactively to manage your cortisol levels. For example, eating a high protein breakfast within 1 hour of waking, which is when your cortisol spikes, that will help to then regulate your mood and your hormone levels overall. So there's a huge amount that can be done. And then, a lot of women, again, they will report feeling like they got themselves back, they got their lives back, they got their careers back when they start on hormone replacement therapy, because that little boost of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, whatever they're taking is just taking the edge off these wild fluctuations and is helping them to regulate the other aspects of their chemical messaging systems more effectively.
Right, I'm going to have to bring you in. I can't believe how the time is absolutely flying by. So we've launched the first poll. You should be able to see it. Our first question we want to ask, and we're going to follow this up in a few minutes' time with another one. What do you want most to understand better about autism? Is it how autism shows up in children, how autism shows up in adults, autism in women and girls, speaking to exactly what Sophie was talking about there, masking, which is where we started with that question, burnout and sensory overload, which is kind of where Sophie also started this, the conversation, support at school or university, support at work, or how family and friends can help. So please vote now, and then we'll come back to your results in a second. I do want to, while the audience is voting as well, I do want to bring in one of the questions from the audience as well, which I think will also be good for you, Shereen, to answer, which is, it's an overview, but there is a noticeable, and this is from Hannah, thank you for your question, a notable increase in autism worldwide now. Is there any attribution to it?
So basically, rates of diagnosis are on the rise due to increased awareness, support. And for people thinking, like, let's say this part of the world has more the prevalence than this. So prevalence and diagnosis rates are not the same. The prevalence is the same everywhere. So if we're talking about rates of diagnosis, that can absolutely vary from place to place, places that have resources, support, cultural differences. And also rates of diagnosis even for girls can vary because, again, some parts of the world could be more educated on this idea that girls are missing a lot from the sphere just because they present quite differently. And so just to follow up on what Sophie was saying, just with an example. So, just you picture this young autistic girl who is really looking to make friends, but struggles with social communication and approaching people, but really, really, really wants those friends. So instead of withdrawing, which may be what a lot of autistic people might do, that girl might start watching those girls a bit more closely, start copying how they speak, start even rehearsing conversations in her head before she goes up and talks to you, so she can have everything nicely laid out there, forces eye contact, all of those things. That's a very different presentation than boys. And also some of the more obviously, say, problematic behaviors in boys show up in girls very differently. So it won't show up as this aggressive behavior. Rather, it could be depression, could be anxiety, could be perfectionism, could be fatigue, extreme, and those aren't the metrics necessarily that we have used historically. So those kind of things can be really, really different from place to place. So that's what I wanted to say, that it's the rates of diagnosis that are on the rise, and it's due to a bunch of different factors, but, not at least like things like increased awareness and societal support for these resources.
Thank you. And thank you for voting. So we kind of got a bit of an even split between 22.7% wanting to know more about autism in women and girls, 22% exactly the same, wanting to know more about masking burnout and sensory overload, and then in almost equal share as well about autism shows up in children. I will bring in a couple of questions from the audience members as well. Again, there are so much things that we could ask. Bader, thanks for being patient with us, because I know you were offered a question up earlier. Why level 3 autistic nonverbal children progress in an extremely slow way despite dedicated therapy? Can a 6-year-old nonverbal ever talk? What are the stats? So obviously Bader must be asking from a personal experience there or a connection. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, they absolutely can talk. I think the key thing to keep in mind is what kind of supports are we targeting, and the fact that this isn't a homogenous group of people. So people have very different needs. We were just talking about sliders right now.
Yeah,
so there's a slider for communication, a slider for the repetitive behaviors, a slider for sensory differences, and that really varies from child to a child. So the something that parents initially pursue, maybe even with the support of a school or a center, is to try to put an individualized plan in place for that child. So we identify this child's strengths, support needs, and sort of go from there. So when somebody says that, let's say this child is not improving despite all this help and resources, I would actually ask, what are you basing this on? Right? You might have this understanding in your mind that someone nonverbal can just completely flip with all these therapies in place, like speech therapy, occupational therapy, and your goal is for them to be as typical as possible. That was never the goal to begin with. We are just trying to support the person to become comfortable, successful as they can be. So I would just, first of all, ask, what are the outcome measures that you're thinking of? What are the goals that you're putting for this child? And what kind of supports are they actually receiving? So that would be my starting point.
There's a word in what you just said there that really hit me as well, which was like, the outcome that we're trying to get to is that this person becomes more typical. And I'm not sure that's actually what I want for my daughter or for my children. I want them to be as unique and characterful and all that. So rather, the best person they can be, rather than society's view of what a typical person should be.
The younger brother, when he went through that regressive state, lost a lot of skills, social skills, language skills, so far. So for someone who had been, let's say, 400 words at age 2, very social, eye contact, talking, but then when we looked at, let's say, like thinking about progress, even something like just me hearing my name again, he has now said my name again when he had stopped saying my name. Now you're saying my name again. That's huge. Someone picking up a fork again. a knife again. Someone just, a lot of people might think this isn't much to look at, but for that person, that's actually a lot of progress. And that should be the comparison point. Where are they now?
I'm going to stop. I'm sorry. I always have to put the audience first. Sorry, Alison. But it is a good question as well, because Maheshwar, thank you again. And thank you for sharing. He's also saying, I have a son who's aged 16 years old, struggled to get him in regular school. He's now going to special needs schools. Could the panelists please advise whether there are online resources, training programs or support platforms that can help individuals with autism develop life skills, vocational skills, and the independence needed to become more self-reliant? So I think that's we should close off the last 15 minutes of this conversation trying to be hyper-focused on practical measures. So Maheshwar's question, obviously you do a lot of work, Sophie, supporting women and women's health. Where are the resources that families and individuals can go to get help and support?
So I think there are an increasing number of communities, support groups for different ages and stages. A woman called Sophie Thomas, for example, runs an ADHD support group with her son. I think one of the things that I missed the most growing up, because I didn't understand how my brain worked, was exposure to people who thought like me. And you kind of find them accidentally. I can tell a neurodivergent person within 5 minutes of meeting them. But I think being able to connect in a way that is comfortable for you, there was a longitudinal study done by Harvard that showed the single greatest predictor of long life and good health was social connection. And that's as true for neurodivergent individuals as it is for neurotypical ones. So even ahead of some of these online courses, etc., can you find social groups where your child can connect in a way that is comfortable and fruitful for them? So finding other children that are similarly neurodivergent to yours, where they feel like they can be themselves without masking, I think is extremely beneficial.
Shereen, I'll ask you to build on Sophie's response there.
Yes. I first want to start out by saying that just when I reflect on the brother's journey, and I said at what cost, basically, is that the goal is for the child to not just be present in a class, but you want that child to feel a sense of agency, safety, comfort, and so on. And I would definitely try to encourage people to understand that might not necessarily be the right fit for your child. So your child doesn't necessarily have to go to school. If they do go to school, there could be a couple of different paths here. So say they could go to school, let's say part-time or a short day, but then they can also get these support services at a dedicated centers, things like speech therapy, community services, being around their peers, doing activities together, or it could be even the reverse, where basically you are based at a center among your peers who are also autistic, taking speech therapy, occupational therapy, doing all sorts of different things together, but you have the opportunity to join mainstream school activities so that you can have wider peers as well. So basically, there's a parent support group that I work closely with for my research at Al Jalila Foundation. They're a very active group. They do have those types of events, initiatives where both themselves, parents, siblings, and the children come together. So I would definitely echo that and say that you should look for those types of support to support independent living, which is a goal.
I think what we'll do as well is after the last session, we put a little bit of a fact sheet together based on the insights that had been shared in the podcast, because actually a lot of information to soak up. We'll also ask Sophie and Dr. Shereen just to share some links to support groups that they feel that have worked really, really well. So you'll have those as a resource. A couple of you have asked very, very specific coverage questions. We are going to pass them on to the team, and rather than get into a backwards and forwards on policies, we see you and we're going to pass those to the team to follow up on. I want to bring a question from Babu in as well. Babu, thanks very much, because this kind of shifts from the family situation back into the workplace. Babu's asking, how should a person navigate a situation where undiagnosed autism has led to autistic burnout due to years of masking without awareness alongside causing chronic depression and anxiety. Do workplaces have policies or accommodations that can support someone in this situation? And I think the answer would be some good ones, yes. Yeah. Too many, no. But what do those accommodate? And I don't like the term accommodations as well. But what are some of the, the support measures? I think you talked about as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be openly said this is an inclusive measure. It's just there woven into the DNA of the organisation. But what does good look like in that space?
I think whole person care is really important. It's very easy to compartmentalize people. And, to have, for example, an annual health check that exclusively looks at the physical side, to put mental health in another category, emotional and social health in a different category, nutritional health somewhere else. I think one of the biggest issues among women, for sure, especially when they reach perimenopause, which often coincides with the pinnacle of the career, the place where they have the most expectations, the place where perhaps they become caregivers not only of their children but also of their parents. It becomes a little bit of a hot spot. The thing that often women need at that point, because they are burnt out for all sorts of reasons. Some of it is neurodivergence related. A lot of it is just societal expectation related, is to provide them with this whole person, multi-specialty support and advice that is not sort of specialist centered and isolated. So it's unhelpful to be told by one specialist that you need to do these things, and then by another specialist, let's say you have your endocrinologist here, your obstetrician gynecologist here, your personal trainer here, they're all telling you different things that can, again, especially for an autistic person with a systematizing mind, actually contribute to instead of helping burnout. So understanding that, again, women are incredibly chemically complex creatures in a very wonderful way, but we need people to look at us as a whole, and the medical system is not in any way independent or separate from this. Is important. So from a workplace perspective, it's having policies where there is some join up. It's not having, your insurance here with your EAP here and your mental health support and hotline here, and nothing really talks to each other. And you've got, discrete benefits that for an individual trying to navigate them doesn't make sense. Start with a person-centered approach. How do you get that person, the whole person support that they need?
And it's a very different way to look at it than what you're saying, the way you described EAP. That is how many companies view it. How do you get companies to change that view, to look at the whole health? Because it is a very different perspective.
That's a very interesting question.
Something what we're trying to do as well at Mental, isn't it? And we've been working together. But it is a massive conversation for organisations just to wake up to... But the reward on this as well, and the ROI of actually getting this right.
Yeah.
And I did what I said I wasn't going to do, Sophie, which was interrupt. Sorry.
No, so it's fine. I mean, you'd be actually surprised how many companies I have spoken to that have the view that, let's say, listen, this is something that affects 1% of the population, which is not much. And again, I'm just saying what they're saying, but I'm about to respond. This is just 1% of the population. Does it make sense to make those kind of investments and also make them for different populations too, so not just that one condition. And I would start off by saying that, let's say it is 1%, that's 80 million people if we're looking worldwide. But then 1% is never the full story. There are plenty of autistic people walking around with no diagnosis. Some may never even have one. Some may avoid it due to stigma. Some don't even have the right access to specialists. Some cannot afford an assessment. There are many barriers to getting a diagnosis. So that might put that number closer to 2 to 3%, which is like 140 to 160 to 240 million people worldwide.
Wow.
And forget that as well, or actually just on top of that, you need to think about like the wider circle. So now if you factor in their parents, siblings, peers, colleagues, employers, that's a lot of people. That's hundreds of millions of people that are basically dealing with autism on a day-to-day basis. You still have to deal with that person, and that person has to deal with you. That's not going to go anywhere. And effectively, that just makes them think, I didn't really think of it that way. It's also the only, as far as I know, the only neurodevelopmental condition in the UAE that has its own dedicated national policy. And everything else is just subsumed under people of determination as a framework. So we know that it's UAE national priorities, and I really do hope that employers listen more to research.
You can see that as well from the government level, the new frameworks that are coming out. You can see, and I've said this many times, like you can see that the government, the public sector is kind of leaning into this, and but both the rewards and also the need to support far quicker and far faster than the private sector is. I kind of always say to the private sector as well, like if you to ask what percentage of people have mental health or experience it, that would be 100%, as opposed to 1 or 2%.
Can I squeeze one in before you
absolutely.
find your question?
Because I've still got the final poll to do as well.
Yes. If somebody's listening to this podcast and what you're saying resonates as an adult, and you're thinking, that sounds familiar, what would your advice be to those, again, if we stick to the adult side of things, because a lot of the conversation is about children, but what would you say to anybody who's listening who is familiar with some of the points you've mentioned? What advice would you give them?
I would encourage them to get in touch. I'm sure you'll distribute, along with the fact sheet, contact information, etc. But I think it's one of these things, again, from our perspective, so many women suffer in silence. We get a lot of women who are, again, particularly perimenopausal, who are literally desperate, who've spent 35, 40, 45 years feeling like they don't fit, and then getting to a point just when they are kind of, again, at the pinnacle of their careers where they feel like they're going crazy, and the support systems don't exist for them in the way that they should. So I think, get in touch. I think it's a really important conversation. We know that, there's a lot of work being done now to retain and support women in the workforce, getting into those senior executive level positions, getting onto boards. There are board mandates that have been circulated. So it's a really important conversation. And we know from experience, again, back to your point around pruning, the pruning of some neural pathways and connections in the brain results in the strengthening of others, and how that manifests itself in a work environment is often people who are exceptionally talented in particular areas, exceptionally good at certain things. And I mean, neurodevelopment is fascinating, but with neurodivergent children, it's about watching what they naturally lean into, where their brains develop faster, trying to open up the world and align the world a little bit more around them, so that they can, with their neural connections that are firing faster than the average person's, really develop and thrive. And I think the same is true for neurodivergent individuals in the workforce. If you have policies in place, inclusive policies in place, you will be strengthening your workforce by retaining these people who today might be struggling a little bit.
The latest mic drop moment in this conversation. Very, very quickly, we're going to launch the second poll, which I should have brought in earlier, but I was just so engrossed in the amazing conversation that we've been having. So for you guys out there as well, in terms of practical support, what would help you more, particularly in the workplace? Clearer communication and expectations, more predictable routines and fewer sudden changes, better sensory awareness and quieter spaces, more confidence talking about autism, better support for parents and families, more training for managers or teachers, or better access to assessment and guidance. And usually option A, as usual, it's not there because we're forcing you to make a choice, but it could be all of the above. But the interesting thing while people are voting as well, just to close in on, one observation I've had with working with organisations is that they go, you talked about why should we legislate for the 1%, but I have never seen any of these if we have to use the word accommodations, any of them that would have made a workplace worse for anybody, whether they were neurotypical or neurodiverse. So why are we not approaching the workplace with this kind of, as you say, whole person, universal design, as opposed to, we're just going to measure it at what typical should be? Thoughts to close the podcast on.
Why are we not doing that? I would say we've started to do that a little bit. I might flag a recent project that I did with called Wider Web. And so the idea is that there's
This will be the Mental Award winning
yes.
project.
Yes, and it's just this the web extension that aims to transform a lot of the websites to be more autistic friendly. And so it has all these different features in it, like 8-9 features, and you'd think there's probably like, thousands of extensions in the world. So what is this one going to really add? We do have a lot of extensions out there in the world, but how many of them have been independently evaluated by research? How many of them were co-produced with with people who have a lived experience? And also you tend to get one for each thing. So like there's an extension for color, there's an extension for font, and the particular one has like 8-9 in one free downloadable extension, and it was co-produced with the autistic community here, people with a lived experience here, and we have independently evaluated it with research. So one of the things that is just coming out at me is that we developed it specifically for autistic people. This is owned by and I was involved in the science there, and but we tend to find that a lot of other people are finding it quite useful. So I am neurotypical. I don't like pop-up ads. I don't like all these things that actually are screaming on that screen. So we're starting to have some preliminary findings to say that actually all these other people with different conditions, some of them have no conditions, some of them are neurotypical, actually benefiting from this type of universal design. So there are some initiatives like that try to demonstrate basically, or actually maybe this wasn't even the goal, is to show that we were focusing on autistic people, but then you realize that all these people are benefiting from the way that mind works, from those sensitivities.
Yeah. So the top answer was actually better access to assessment and guidance, but within that, more training for managers and teachers, better sensory awareness, quieter spaces, and better support for parents and families. We are over time. That's my bad. But Sophie, I want to give you one last moment to either respond to what Dr. Shereen was saying there, or just anything else you feel around this topic that you want to share before we close the conversation.
I'd say again, to a point around access and an example about how thinking about the minority can benefit the majority. So the fact that the UAE has made almost 100% of its facilities accessible to people of determination means that also for anybody pushing a buggy, public spaces are that much more accessible. The metro is more accessible. That's
such a good example.
Yeah, so your average neurotypical person perhaps doesn't realize that their life has been made infinitely better at the point at which they become a parent because steps have been taken to include the minority.
Amazing. I think that's such a great point. I'm going to let you close because I've not let you speak very much
okay.
as well, Alison. We're actually, on this podcast, this is the least I've spoken any, I think, episode. But your takeaway before we say goodbye to our audience.
I really just want to say thank you. It's been fascinating. I could listen to you all day. Again, coming from a background of not having huge interactions with it, I do find it fascinating. So I've probably got 100 more questions I'll ask you when we finish. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for getting involved. Thank you for your questions. We try to cover as many of them as we will. We will do the fact sheet. We will share the links. And those of you who are asked cover specific questions, the Cigna team will get onto them and respond. So as usual, after the podcast finishes, after the recording finishes, you will be asked for your feedback. Please give it us. Be as honest as you like. We listen to it. It helps shape. It in fact helps shape this conversation because you asked for it. So we are listening, and it helps us actually improve the conversations for you. So thank you again. Join us next time on Connect for Health. And one more time, thank you, Dr. Shereen and Dr. Sophie and Alison. Thank you very much.